and welcome to this special live stream event with Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland. I'm Dan Schulman, and I'm the Deputy Washington Bureau Chief for Mother Jones Magazine. We are days out from what could be the most important and high-stakes election of our lifetimes. There's been no shortage of drama. The death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the elevation of Amy Coney Barrett have tilted the Supreme Court dramatically to the right. A coronavirus outbreak struck at the White House, sickening the president and others. And of course, there's that October surprise, courtesy of Rudy Giuliani and friends who appear to be aiding a foreign disinformation campaign. There's no one better to discuss these topics and more than Congressman Raskin, who is a former constitutional law professor at American University. Early in his career, he was an assistant attorney general in Massachusetts, and he served as general counsel of Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition. One piece of interesting trivia, Congressman Raskin once represented Ross Perot when he was frozen out of the 1996 presidential debates. Before joining Congress in 2016, Congressman Raskin served in the Maryland State Senate. He's a member of the Judiciary and Oversight Committees, where he's investigated the Trump administration's politicization of the census, white supremacist infiltration of law enforcement, and the mistreatment of immigrants at for-profit detention centers. I have a lot of questions for the congressman, and I know you may too. So please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will try to get to them as we go along. Welcome, Congressman.
James, thank you for having me. I am delighted to be with you and with Mother Jones. I've been out quoting Mother Jones a lot ever since Ruth Bader Ginsburg died about pray for the dead, but fight like hell for the living.
Well, so we're a few days away from the election. How are you sleeping these days? How are you feeling?
Well, it's funny, the last several weeks, it's been rough, and I have insomniac tendencies anyway, but it's been rough. But I got to tell you, it's getting better and better, because the closer we get to the election, the more it's clear that the Republicans and Trump have not figured out any way to change the essential dynamics of the race. I mean, it's going to be a massive landslide popular repudiation of his lethal mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic and his constant, unstoppable lying. But, you know, I'm telling everybody, we're going to win massively in the vote. We still have to win the election, which is a different thing, because the Republicans have every trick in the book.
Well, I wanted to ask you about some legislation you recently introduced, or I guess reintroduced. It was first introduced in 2017. And this was a bill to examine the mental fitness of presidents. What on earth would have given you the idea that we need such a commission to look at the sanity of our commanders in chief?
Well, it's in the 25th Amendment itself. The 25th Amendment has four parts. The first one says if there's a vacancy in the presidency, the vice president becomes president. The second part says if there's a vacancy in the vice presidency, the president nominates someone who, by concurrent majorities of the House and Senate, becomes the VP. The third one says the president can voluntarily and temporarily transfer the powers of office to the vice president and then resume them just by writing another letter to Congress. But the fourth one says, Section 4 says, the vice president and a majority of the cabinet, or the vice president and a majority of a body set up by Congress, can determine that the president is unable to execute the powers and duties of office, in which case the powers are transferred to the vice president. And that body was never set up. It's not just about mental fitness. Of course, it's about physical fitness, or about anything that would make it impossible for the president to execute the duties of his or her office. And so, you know, COVID-19 concentrates the mind. You know, the president went in without activating Section 3 and voluntarily turning the powers over to Pence. What if he had ended up on a ventilator and was unable to speak? What if he was in a coma? What would happen? Who's in charge there? Because the Constitution doesn't say at that point. Is it the chief of staff? Is it the Secretary of State? Is it the VP? Is it the First Lady? I mean, all these things have happened in American history. And the whole point of the 25th Amendment is set up a structure in the nuclear age where there is stability of office and continuity of power.
Maybe, can you explain to me a bit about how this commission would come into effect? Would the vice president have to sort of activate this, and how would the process work?
Yeah, nothing happens without the vice president, but you also need either the cabinet, a majority of the cabinet, or a majority of the new body to determine that there's an incapacity. And then it would be able to notify Congress about what's happening, the House and the Senate. And the 25th Amendment says the president can resist and say, no, everything's fine. I can resume duties. And if the commission and the vice president still say, no, there's a serious problem here, at that point, Congress has to vote, and it requires a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, which is a more difficult threshold than impeachment. So it was designed in such a way that it could not be used politically. It's more difficult than impeachment. And the vice president has always got to be involved. So it can't be a partisan thing. Our commission is bipartisan in nature, set up by the majority and minority leaders in both the House and the Senate. Half of the members would be physicians, including psychiatrists, psychologists, and half of the members would be former high-ranking people in the executive branch, including former presidents, vice presidents, AG, secretary of the Treasury, attorneys general, surgeon general, and so on.
Do you think we could count on this commission to sort of render consensus? Because obviously, you can be a doctor and be quite partisan. We see Scott Atlas in the White House, the doctor who's advising Trump on the coronavirus, who's, saying basically you don't need to wear a mask.
Right. Well, I mean, the idea is that it would be broad enough, comprehensive enough, and let's hope nonpartisan enough that they would be able to deal with a real crisis. There's a very good article in the current issue of the New Yorker by a professor at Harvard Law School saying that this commission absolutely is necessary for the lame duck period after the election. Everybody's terrified that there are a lot of people are terrified that Trump is going to try to figure out a way to basically barricade himself into office and to be a squatter. Well, the 25th Amendment says the 25th Amendment exists if the president is unable to execute the powers and the duties of office. One of the duties of office is knowing when and how to leave the office. If you don't leave office when you're supposed to and respect the peaceful transfer of power, you're not rendering the duties of office. And it might be for physical, cognitive, psychological, mental. It doesn't make any difference what the reasons are. If you're unable to do that, then the power should be transferred over to the vice president so the vice president can actually conduct the transition.
Do you think that Trump will transfer power peacefully if he loses the election?
Well, but I don't know. I mean, none of us is clairvoyant. I mean, obviously, the recent record is not a very reassuring one because he seems to have foreclosed the possibility that he will just lose the election. I was a little bit uplifted by something he said the other day. He said, "Can you imagine my losing to Joe Biden, the worst candidate there ever was?" But he did say losing to, and before everything that he was saying was that the only way we can lose is if they steal it, if there's fraud or there's chaos. And all of that, of course, is an attempt to create a smoke screen so that people can't figure out what's going on, enough chaos, and then maybe to get some state legislatures in swing states that are controlled by Republicans to disregard the election results, nullify the election, repeal the existing election statute, and hastily pass another one, simply appointing the electors for Trump. I mean, that's what they've been talking about doing and threatening to do. And we're preparing for every eventuality there. We think that there are real problems with their doing that legally and constitutionally. For one thing, the election law of the state of Pennsylvania, for example, or Wisconsin, is something that exists under the state constitution of Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, which means it's got to go to the governor for his or her signature. That's how those the original election laws were written. They can't just say, well, we're going to repeal the old one that was a real law that we passed in the state, and then we're going to use some heretofore unknown powers that we have under Article 2 of the Constitution just to appoint electors without the election process. That also violates the whole meaning and spirit of the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which says you get the benefit of the safe harbor on December 14th if you get your electors in, if it is based on a pre-existing election law, right? In other words, the the federal law assumes and contemplates and really insists upon the fact that the award of electors is consistent with a pre-existing law and not according to some improvised, impromptu statutory framework that they just concoct overnight.
I wanted to go back to something you said a few minutes ago where you were saying, Congress, members of Congress are prepared for any sort of event or preparing for any sort of eventuality. Have you been almost wargaming scenarios that could play out and trying to figure out the steps that you would take if that sort of thing happened? And what sort of scenarios are you prepping for?
Well, it's Halloween is a couple of days away, and Halloween's a good time to investigate some of the dark recesses of the Electoral College because it is a creaky and antiquated and obsolete institution in some ways. But we've got to defend it with everything that we've got. We've got to defend the popular vote and then the translation of the popular vote into the Electoral College such as it exists. But there are definitely opportunities for strategic mischief and corruption. We've seen that before. We saw that in 2000 in Bush versus Gore, where a 5-justice conservative majority on the court proclaimed directly enough that, of course, the individual citizen has no constitutional right to vote for president. The power belongs to the state legislatures. And so we are getting that kind of elevation and lionization of the state legislatures here. We just want to make sure that certainly they've got a proper role, which they have played by putting these election statutes into place. But Article 2 does not say the state legislatures can do whatever they want, whenever they want, and fix elections. On the contrary, it says that each state shall appoint in a manner chosen by the state legislature a number of electors equal to their representatives in the Senate. So it's the state that is awarding the electors. It's not the legislature's electors. And of course, our whole constitutional trajectory has been away from just vesting power in the legislature and saying, you get to control this regardless of anything else. I mean, the whole meaning of the 17th Amendment was to say the state legislatures do not control the appointment of U.S. senators. That's something that the people have. And in the same way, as even the Bush versus Gore majority acknowledged that history has favored the participation of the people in presidential elections. And that's the meaning of federal law. And, we intend to insist upon that. And we will reject any effort of rogue runaway legislatures to overturn popular results, in the service of some concocted idea of chaos or fraud.
The fact that we're even having this conversation about, will Trump step down willingly kind of illustrates the degree to which this administration has shattered so many norms over the past 4 years. On the ethical front, this president and his family have mingled their personal interests with the public's interest to an unprecedented degree. And then there's this administration's approach to the separation of powers. This administration has often sought to thwart congressional oversight. It's ignored requests for information, rejected subpoenas, and asserted dubious implications of executive privilege. You experienced that when Corey Lewandowski came before the Oversight Committee and basically refused to answer questions and invoked privilege. Tell us about your efforts to conduct meaningful oversight in this type of atmosphere.
Well, it's been nothing short of impossible. The president and administration, at a certain point, when the Democrats took the House back after the 2018 election, the beginning of 2019, the president basically ordered the executive branch to stop complying with all congressional subpoenas and demands for requests, demands for information and documents. And the remarkable thing about this is that the Republicans have always been adamant, that is, when Democrats are president, that the power of Congress to ask for information it seeks is unlimited, it's plenary, and the president has to go along with it. I mean, there can be negotiation about when it's turned over and how it's turned over and so on. But I mean, just think about the Benghazi investigation. I mean, right. Millions and millions of documents, tens of millions of dollars and so on. But when we got in a situation of not being able to get basic information about anything, whether it was the census or whether it was the White House Personnel Office, whether it was them trying to purge and censor and stifle climate researchers and the mention of climate change. Website, anything we tried to get, they would just say no, they would not cooperate. They would not cooperate. And as you know, we've been involved in a whole lot of litigation about that. But it's an essential frustration of the constitutional design. I mean, we don't have a king here. We were conceived in revolutionary insurgency against the monarchs, against the kings. The Articles of Confederation didn't even have a president in it. That was added later in the Constitution. But if you look at the design of the Constitution, we don't have, in that famous cliche, 3 co-equal branches. The Congress is the primary branch of government. If we're equal, we are first among equals. It's in Article 1. It comes right after the preamble of the Constitution. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and preserve to ourselves and posterity the blessings of liberty, do hereby ordain and establish the Constitution of the United States. The very next sentence is Article 1, saying all legislative powers are vested in the Congress of the United States. So the sovereign power of the people as delegated to Congress to create the country, to create the Constitution, flowed right into Congress. And then you get the enumeration of dozens and dozens of powers that Congress has, all the way up to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, saying, and all other powers necessary and proper to the execution of the foregoing powers. And then finally, you've got everything out there regulating commerce, providing for the taxes, the spending power, power to declare war. Then you get to Article 2, the executive power is vested in the president. 4 short paragraphs. The 4th paragraph is all about impeaching the president, how you impeach a president for bribery and treason and other high crimes and misdemeanors. And then the rest of it is basically he's commander in chief, not of the country, not of the government, but of the Army and the Navy and the state militias when called up into actual service when there's a war. And the rest of it is his job is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, right? So it's not even close who's supposed to have the real power. We can impeach the president. The president can't impeach us. And everything has been turned so topsy-turvy. But I mean, Trump is just the cartoon example of that, because this is a long traveling process through both Democratic and Republican presidents. And we've got to restore the right balance. But oversight is central to it because, like James Madison said, he said, those who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. So how can we legislate and decide what laws to have for the country if we can't get the information that we need from the president and executive branch?
Now, obviously, you can hold recalcitrant witnesses in contempt. And in fact, Congress did that last year with Bill Barr and Wilbur Ross in connection, in fact, with the census hearings. And this was a dramatic step, but nothing came of it. Obviously, it would have to go to the Justice Department. Are there other tools that Congress could use to compel testimony and documents, or?
Yeah, well, we used some of the contempt power. Like we didn't try criminal contempt because that would require essentially going to Bill Barr and the Department of Justice, U.S. Attorney. Civil contempt, money damages. And then what we've got, and this is what we're pushing for, is a rules change so that this never happens to us again, is the inherent power of contempt that Congress has. The Supreme Court said repeatedly, beginning in a case called Anderson versus Dunn in the early 19th century, that Congress has the power to enforce its own orders, just like a court does. And so in those days, that included the power of arrest. You send out the sergeant at arms, or you send out the U.S. Marshals to get somebody. But it certainly includes the power of fine as well. And I know some people are more comfortable with fining contumacious executive branch officials, which means those showing contempt. But we really have got to build that in there because it was an absurd situation that created for a dysfunctional arrangement, and all of that in service of basically a dysfunctional state or a failed state. I mean, that's where we are right now. I mean, a failed state is one that doesn't protect the population against disease, against random gun violence, against people getting into office and using it as an instrument of money making and private corruption, all of those things. I mean, we've become a banana republic under this guy.
One of the areas that the Oversight Committee and your subcommittee in particular have investigated is the Trump administration's efforts to interfere with the census process. And at a hearing last month, you said, the census is only important for two things, money and power. If you don't care about money or power, don't worry about the census. Earlier this month, of course, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Trump administration's effort to halt the census early. What are the stakes here? And is there any recourse?
Well, I mean, the census was put into the Constitution as a complement to the idea of we the people. Now, of course, that was fatally compromised at that point by slavery and the disenfranchisement of a majority of the people. But the idea was there that you count up who the people are, and that's what the government's got to pay attention to. And, you know, that's closely connected to the idea of one person, one vote. But we use the census to determine how many representatives of Congress your state gets, how many state legislators it gets, and which populations and where it is, and county council and city council all the way down. And we use it for the distribution of billions of dollars of federal program money. So it's essential, but the administration has been waging war on the census from the beginning, like the way it's been waging war on other essential public institutions like the post office.
And is there anything more that can be done now that the process has been halted?
Well, you know, our committee has been doing everything we can to create education and PR to get out through the states and the localities, telling people to participate in the census. And so we've been trying to do everything we can in terms of direct action education of the public, and to have hearings to do oversight to show what's working and what's not working. But things that we thought were kind of outside the arena of partisan contest, like the post office, like the census, have been dragged under the thumb of the Trump administration, have been dragged into partisan politics and his re-election campaign.
Well, speaking of that, you know, at the start of the impeachment process, you said that the evidence indicated not only high crimes and misdemeanors, but a constitutional crime that was still underway. And I think it's not hard to argue that that crime is still in progress in light of recent efforts by Rudy Giuliani and others to smear Joe Biden with the purported contents of his son's laptop. The New York Times reported recently that a White House lawyer was involved in teeing up Hunter Biden dirt for the Wall Street Journal. Steve Bannon is working with a fugitive Chinese billionaire to further this story. The election interference is coming from inside the White House, you could even say.
Yeah.
Is this, and should this be probed by Congress immediately?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you know, there are different ways of conceptualizing what has happened to us, but I think the easiest way to think of it is that, you know, the Republican Party is like a mass religious cult surrounding an organized crime family. And, you know, Trump got in and basically bucked centuries of tradition. He said he was going to continue to keep operating his businesses, more than 500 businesses all over the world, profit-making activities. He was not going to divest himself. He was not going to put it into a blind trust. He was going to absolutely keep profiting and benefiting from all of it. But the kids would basically take over day-to-day management, such as it is. We have seen since then the president taking millions and millions of dollars from foreign governments, whether it's Saudi Arabia or China or United Arab Emirates or Azerbaijan or Indonesia, and he's been taking millions of dollars directly from the taxpayers in the looting of the Treasury for all of their trips to the New Jersey golf course, or down to Mar-a-Lago, or to Scotland or Ireland, or you name it. There's a great article in the Washington Post today about the millions of dollars that have been taken from the government by the administration. So it's a money-making operation. And the president's major political and policy commitment since coming to office is to stay in office and to get reelected, and then to use every lever of power he's got in foreign policy and domestic policy to entrench himself, to try to tear down the basic institutions of democracy, whether it's the press and the media, or it's the post office and the census, or it's the election system and the mail-in balloting that a number of states have been doing for many, many years now, including red states like Utah and blue states like Oregon. But it's just this war against anything that he views as getting in the way of his reelection. And you know, the New York Times has done good work in trying to piece together the taxes with the help of Mary Trump and some other, I think, whistleblowers. But this is a man who's in debt hundreds of millions of dollars to foreign interests. He's facing all kinds of criminal prosecutions for everything from campaign finance violations to the other, white collar crimes, to sexual assault and rape. All those kinds of things are out there. And so he's a desperate man who's desperately trying to stay in office to keep a good thing going so he can continue looting the public. But there's no public agenda. They didn't even have a platform in the 2020. They said, oh yeah, just use the old one, use 2016. And for the greatest public health emergency that we've seen as a country in a century, their strategy, as Mark Meadows put it on TV the other day, is no strategy. He said, we're not trying to stop the disease. And it's very clear. I mean, the top ranking people on COVID-19 are invoking this idea of herd immunity, which is not a strategy for fighting a disease. It's a statement of what may take place once a disease has ravaged a population. So they're talking about hundreds of thousands more people or millions more people dying before you get to herd immunity. Because anything else just gets in the way.
You might not even get there because antibodies might fade. So it seems like that's certainly not a strategy that is going to be terribly effective in the long term. But this is something you sort of touched on. I'm curious about this notion of accountability in the aftermath of Trump's presidency if he's not reelected. What does that look like? Because at the conclusion of the Bush administration, there was quite a bit of popular fury over what had transpired during his presidency, particularly with regard to torture. There was talk of potential prosecutions, but the Obama administration more or less decided to turn the page. I'm wondering if you think that is a mistake, and what does accountability look like at the end of Trump's presidency?
Well, we've got to turn the page on this period of lawlessness and corruption. And what that means is to get back to the rule of law and accountability and an end to impunity for crimes committed by high-ranking state officials. So I simply hope that we will have a Justice Department in place, that we will have prosecutors around the country who do their jobs. That's it. And we've got to get over this infection we have from Donald Trump that the president's job is to decide who gets prosecuted for what. That's not Joe Biden's job. It's not the job of the Congress to do. It's really up to law enforcement if it has credible evidence of crimes that have been taken. There's a whole panoply of decisions that it goes through about whether or not to investigate and prosecute. And for me, to depoliticize law enforcement means not to prosecute people just because they hold or held public office, but it also means not to not prosecute them just because they held public office. So the idea that, well, we'll just get over it like a banana republic, we'll put their crimes aside, so our crimes will be set aside when it's our turn to leave office, is completely at odds with the best of our traditions.
So you would potentially support a prosecution of Donald Trump if depending on the grounds. I mean, obviously there's a lot of stuff out there about tax fraud and that sort of stuff, and he and his company are currently under investigation on multiple fronts. So it's not impossible.
If that's what the law and facts call for, absolutely. We don't have immunity or impunity for presidents or former presidents, nor should we. And that's especially true when the arguments are made during the course of the administration to not do oversight, and we're not turning anything over and so on. If there's crimes, it'll be discovered later after the president leaves. I mean, that was always the go-to argument, that it could be prosecuted later. So they make a bizarre champion for the idea that the president shouldn't be prosecuted once he's left office.
Some have raised the possibility of a sort of Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the wake of Trump's presidency. Is that an idea that you would support?
Truth and Reconciliation Commissions have, to my knowledge, been deployed when you have a regime change from a period like in South Africa of decades and decades of apartheid, an organized system of injustice and human rights violation and racism. And then there's an attempt to move into a liberal democracy, and you're dealing with massive systemic crimes. And I know that people have suggested having Truth and Reconciliation Commissions about American apartheid and racism. And I think there's a lot of logic there. I mean, the Trump administration, we might need something like that if it were actually to get 8 years in office. But I think with just 4 years in office, I think that the normal panoply of law enforcement powers can work to ferret out the crimes that have been taking place and to prosecute them if they're there. So, I'm not, I put it this way, I'm not closing my mind to it, but I'm not quite sure why we would need to do that if we have a real active Department of Justice that's not interested in just covering up political crimes.
Well, in terms of the Department of Justice, it's been so politicized at this point. I'm sort of curious to get your thoughts on how we go about rebuilding some democratic institutions.
It's going to be a long walk home in a lot of ways, in a lot of places. The good thing is that, a lot of the Trump people, followed their guru in really just being in it to try to make as much money as possible. And I think a lot of them are going to get out quickly or will be replaced quickly. I think that there's going to be such a massive nationwide reckoning with what's just happened that there will be a push to put every institution, from the Census to the Post Office to the Department of Justice to the Department of State, back on its regular footing and on its own development as a democratic institution. And I think that's where we are in elections. We're going to have to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to end all of these terrible voter suppression techniques and strategies, and to prevent the kind of undemocratic America that Justice Kavanaugh has in mind for everybody. And we're going to have statehood for people in Washington, D.C., and statehood for people in Puerto Rico. And we got to deal with the Electoral College and pass the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. We're going to have the opportunity, with a massive landslide repudiation of what's just taken place. If we can get that and make it stick, we are going to have the opportunity to rebuild on a much more solid, durable democratic footing. And we're going to be able to keep the dynamics of democracy moving in the country. Tocqueville in Democracy in America wrote that democracy is always either contracting and shriveling away, or it's growing and expanding. And I believe that. And we've been in a period of contraction and shriveling away. But when you look at the tens of millions of people standing in these long lines to go vote, and the incredible mobilization of the democracy right now to take everything back, I believe that we are getting ready for a massive expansion of democratic values and norms and practices in the country.
Now, I just want to remind our audience, you can ask your questions for the Congressman in the comments on Facebook. Feel free to hit us up there with any burning questions. Now is your chance. Got a few comments here. Daniel says on Facebook, "My Congressman, thanks, Rep. Raskin." We've got Frank who's saying, "Awesome information." Okay, well, I did want to ask you about—
Thank you, both of you. I appreciate that.
You brought up the Electoral College. So do you think that in the wake of this election, depending on the outcome, there could be a popular movement to abolish the Electoral College?
Well, yeah, I mean, the public opinion polls show that more than 75 or 80% of the people think that the Electoral College should be done with. I mean, we're spending millions of dollars a year exporting American democracy to other countries to teach people about voting and elections. One thing we never even try to export is the Electoral College. And it's not like there are a lot of countries out there saying, we'd really like to learn more about your Electoral College. We'd like to do things that way. I mean, it just doesn't fit anymore. It was born during a time when America had the most primitive and ill-formed communication systems and transportation systems. A lot of it is just to try to filter out, popular feelings and to try to, get the wise men to deliberate and pick the electors, and the electors pick the president. And I mean, it's antiquated. It doesn't fit anymore. And we've gotten rid of almost every other undemocratic filter in our political process, from then, the disenfranchisement of African Americans and women. We got rid of the state legislatures selecting U.S. senators, and instead doing a popular vote. We got rid of poll taxes, and it's really time to get rid of the Electoral College. It not only has it given us two popular vote losers in the last 5 elections, George W. Bush and Donald Trump, and not only does it confine the whole election to like 7 or 8 swing states, just because of the sheer happenstance that they have relatively close numbers of Democrats and Republicans, thereby turning the rest of the country into spectators, or we're all supposed to send our money to those states or send our volunteers to those states or go work there, which is ridiculous when you think about it. But it also creates all of these opportunities for strategic mischief that we're getting ready for right now, because Donald Trump keeps talking crazy talk about how, well, we're going to get all this settled in the House of Representatives in a contingent election, or, we're going to get the legislatures to overturn the popular vote. Things like that you point out, Dan, really should be outside the realm of imagination, but now it's just part of our common parlance.
Now, Mike Hanover on Facebook asks, what will the Supreme Court do if a change to or elimination of the Electoral College is attempted?
What would the Supreme Court do?
Yeah.
Well, that's an excellent question. I mean, the way the National Popular Vote Plan works is it's an interstate agreement among the states to say, with Maryland, which I'm proud to say was the first state to do it, and it was my first bill that I introduced. But the states that have joined, I think there are now 16 states that are in it, in the District of Columbia, have all said, we will cast our electors not for who wins in our state, we'll cast it for who wins nationwide after all the votes are tallied. And we do have a national tally of the votes. You just add up what the votes are in the states. My sense of it is that we would do this and it would work for 1 or 2 elections. People would say, this is great. Well, the person with the most votes wins. Every vote counts equally. The campaigns are now appealing to people all over America, not just in Florida and Ohio and Wisconsin and Michigan and so on. But then Congress would go ahead and pass a constitutional amendment, and we would just move to popular vote. That we need 2/3 in the House, 2/3 in the Senate, and 3/4 of the states to pass a constitutional amendment. But in the meantime, would the Supreme Court try to strike down the National Popular Vote Compact in some way? I mean, it's possible. And of course, the hallmark of these right-wing conservative originalists and textualists is intense judicial activism, the kind where they hijacked the presidential election in 2000 and stopped the ballot recount of 175,000 ballots that just got left on the table in Florida. And you see exactly where Justice Kavanaugh is going with his really just free-floating right-wing judicial activist opinion that sounded like a Fox News op-ed from the other day.
Well, and this is I do want to ask you about the Supreme Court, because your 2003 book, Overruling Democracy, in which you delve into what you call the Supreme Court's assault on democracy, is extremely relevant right now. In it, you write that what had been a sort of stealth attack on democratic rights led by the conservative justices really exploded into public view with the Bush v. Gore decision, which halted the recount and handed the presidency to George W. Bush. Why did that decision mark such a turning point? And do you fear that at this point we could see a Trump v. Biden case?
Yeah. Well, thank you for reviving my old book. I used to write books. Now I write tweets, I'm in politics. But, in that book, I talk about the decisions that were antecedents to Bush v. Gore, like Shaw versus Reno, where the Supreme Court in extraordinarily activist fashion just said, we're going to strike down bizarrely drawn majority African-American or majority Hispanic districts, not bizarrely drawn majority white districts. And so I have a chapter about the double standard there. And I look at some other cases like that. Forbes versus Arkansas Educational Television Network is another one where the court outrageously upheld the exclusion of third-party and independent candidates from government-sponsored candidate debates, thereby sacralizing the two-party system, which is not a phrase that appears anywhere in the Constitution, and the Constitution doesn't talk about political parties at all, much less a two-party system. But anyway, Bush versus Gore took that trend and said, well, we're going to take it to its logical conclusion. If we can constitutionalize the two-party system, we can constitutionalize a one-party system, and we can just intervene in such a way as to settle the election for one side. I mean, it was a profoundly corrupt decision, which even Alan Dershowitz, who now seems to be lock, stock, and barrel owned by the Trumpies.
Law school professor.
Sorry?
Your old law school professor.
Yeah, he even called it an unprecedentedly corrupt decision. Obviously, Professor Tribe, my con law professor, did a great job of analyzing all of the deficiencies in the reasoning of that. And I tried to do the same thing in Overruling Democracy. But the reason that it was so explosive was because it was the first time in American history where the Supreme Court interfered to stop the counting of ballots, and in a way perfectly cognizant of what they were doing, because they blew the whistle and said, no more counting of ballots. This couldn't be done in enough time to get it in for the safe harbor deadline. Of course, that totally misrepresented what the safe harbor deadline is. It doesn't say you must get your electors in by then, or Congress won't accept your electors when Congress meets in January. It just says under the Electoral Count Act, if you get it in by then, that the presumption by Congress will be that your electors are valid. But that was used by these 5 justices to say, not only is there an equal protection violation where hypothetically different standards might be used in different counties for determining what a hanging chad is, but then we're going to stop the counting of ballots rather than saying, here's the standard, or leave it to the Florida Supreme Court to derive a standard. We're just going to blow the whistle. And the great irony there, of course, is that those counties had already been using different systems before that point. So they basically just said, we're going to make George W. Bush the president. And that's what they did. And that gave us the Iraq War, that popular vote loser who became president, and this popular vote loser who became president gave us the nightmare of COVID-19 run amok in the country without any organized strategy nationally to stop it that the administration has been willing to follow through on and execute.
Now, you brought up Brett Kavanaugh's opinion this week, which I think shocked a lot of people because he invoked the Bush v. Gore decision, which really has not been used as precedent in the past. And some saw this as sort of a precursor to him laying the groundwork, so to speak,
yeah,
in favor of Trump. Is that how you viewed this?
Yeah, well, there are a couple. I mean, there are manifold hypocrisies and contradictions in what Justice Kavanaugh wrote. For one, Bush versus Gore, on its own terms, proclaims that it is not to be used as precedent, and I acknowledge that that creates a little bit of a logical conundrum, because if it says it's not a precedent, do you take as precedent the sentence that it's not a precedent? It's like an MC Escher drawing. But that's number one. Nobody had tried to invoke it in the court in that way before as authority for a particular line of action. The second thing that is extraordinary about it is that Kavanaugh is rallying directly to the diseased rhetoric of Donald Trump, who's saying that no ballots counted after midnight on election day should be counted, which is totally at odds with American history and electoral practices around the country. To begin with, this is a matter of state law. And to the extent it ends up not being a matter of state law, it's because it's going to end up with electors going to Congress. It's a matter for Congress to decide. The president has no role in it whatsoever. And this Supreme Court justice at this point has no role in it whatsoever, but he decides he wants to expound rhetorically to defend what Donald Trump has been saying about how all the ballots have to be counted on election day. And what's truly comic about it, or at least comic if it wouldn't be tragic, if it weren't so tragic, is that this is the exact opposite of what Brett Kavanaugh, as a lawyer, was arguing along with the Republicans in Bush versus Gore, where they were arguing for all of these Republican ballots to be admitted and allowed in, or Republican presumed ballots to come in, like from overseas, from military voters and so on. And of course, the right rule is you count all the ballots, and whenever they arrive, you count them. But it's a matter of state law. Some states, okay, say it's got to be in by midnight on election day. So voters beware, make sure you're mailing it a week in advance. If not, go drop it off at the closest drop-off box if the Republicans haven't taken them down yet. I mean, so you've got to, deal with their various obstacles. But if a state says you've got, we will accept ballots that arrive in the mail up to a week later or 72 hours later, what business is it of the president of the United States or some rogue Supreme Court justice just to be out there opining that that's not a good idea? I mean, it's ridiculous. I think that Justice Kagan slapped him down really hard, and she just said, when you say that ballots coming in after midnight, like Cinderella, coming in after midnight, will spoil the results. She says correctly, there are no results to spoil until all the ballots are counted.
Well,
We've always counted all the ballots.
Yeah, he also seemed to not understand the notion that states don't finalize their vote counts on election night. That's, even though the networks might call it, that's not how it works on the state level at all.
Yeah.
Now,
I think it proves you shouldn't drink beer and write decisions at the same time.
Now, we've got a very relevant reader question here from Daniel Toole, who asks on Facebook, Rep. Raskin, what are your thoughts about adding more seats to the Supreme Court of the United States?
The truth is, I don't know what my thoughts are about that. I know it's perfectly constitutional. I know it's been done 9 different times, and I think everything should be on the table. Obviously, I've not been eager to play into the Republicans' hands by talking about that before the election, and this is what all they've wanted to talk about for the last couple of months, because they were presuming, 1, that Barrett would get through, that they would barrel her through; 2, that we would win the White House, we would win the Senate, and then we would, be able to discuss what to do next. And so, I don't want to count any chickens before they hatch, but I would just say it's an emergency situation with the Supreme Court. I tell my students, for the vast majority of American history, the Supreme Court's been a profoundly reactionary conservative institution. I mean, think about, up until the Civil War, the Supreme Court did nothing to aid any runaway slaves, did nothing to help any African Americans at all. In fact, in the Dred Scott decision, Justice Taney for the court proclaimed the doctrine that the Constitution itself is a white man's compact, and that people who are enslaved and their descendants have no rights that the white man is bound to respect. Okay, so nothing up until the Civil War. Then even after the Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments, what does the court do in 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson? It constitutionalizes the racist apartheid doctrine of separate but equal. And that basically lasts up until the 1960s, when we get the civil rights movement and Bob Moses and SNCC and the revolution in the South for voting rights and for democracy there. And that kicks off a movement that gives us the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. And you get a Supreme Court for a couple decades, which is on the side of the people. And you get, like Brown versus Board and the white primary cases and the Roe versus Wade and Miranda versus Arizona, these kinds of cases. But it doesn't last very long. And then you get the Berger Court and the Rehnquist Court and the Roberts Court, and they return to the baseline of the Supreme Court being a reactionary conservative institution in the service of wealth and power and elite interests in the country. And that's basically where we are now. The reason we've got to deal with it, either by enlarging the court or by instituting term limits or figuring out other answers, is because it is a right-wing judicial activist court that is interested in striking down the progressive laws that America needs in order to make progress on the critical problems of the time, on healthcare. They want to strike down the Affordable Care Act. They're in court a week after Election Day on November 10th, the Trump administration arguing for the demolition of the Affordable Care Act in order to make progress on the environment, on climate change. How are we going to get anything like a Green New Deal with our right-wing Supreme Court prepared to strike it down and to engage in, Lochner Part 2 and to do to our time what the court then did to the New Deal?
Well, we've got to start wrapping this stuff up. I've got a final two questions for you. Just quickly, with a few minutes left, what if Trump pardons himself, or I guess for that matter, his family members? We talked about this idea of accountability. Does that take it off the table?
Well, one thing everybody should remember is that the pardon applies only to federal offenses. So it doesn't help him in state criminal prosecutions. And there are lots of those waiting out there for him too. The Democrats have argued, we've argued that a self-pardon is a contradiction in terms, and that the pardon power does not extend to the ability to pardon oneself. The way to test that would only be for the president or that former president to be prosecuted criminally for something, and then for him to try to interpose his pardon as his defense. And then the court would have to rule, and it would presumably get up to the Supreme Court. And you can imagine what Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Barrett are going to say about that.
Final question for you is, how are you spending election night? And do you have advice for our viewers and readers who are worried about what the aftermath of this election could look like, no matter what happens?
Well, I mean, it's a good point. I've been telling people election day is really halftime, or at least we have to be prepared for it to be halftime, because I think the Republicans have known for a long time that we're going to have commanding popular majorities repudiating Donald Trump and Republicans up and down the ballot. And so they are going to be looking for ways to throw monkey wrenches into the counting of ballots. They're going to be looking for ways to try to get everything into the Supreme Court. They're going to be looking for ways to mess up the count of the electoral college votes when that happens in January, with Vice President Pence as the president of the Senate being the one who's got to do that. And as the president keeps saying, he would love it to go into the House of Representatives. And the reason for that, by the way, is not because he thinks that Nancy Pelosi and the 235 to 200 majority we've got is going to go with him. It's because we don't vote one member, one vote in a contingent election. If it comes to that, we vote one state, one vote. So California gets one, Idaho gets one, New York gets one, Montana gets one. Presently, they have 26 states. We have 22 states, and 2 are tied, Michigan and Pennsylvania. So there's been kind of a shadow campaign going on to win control of sufficient state delegations in the event that they are able to engage in so many antics and pranks and mischief that they're able to get the election kicked into the House of Representatives. We would be ready for them. And it is sorrowful that it's come to it. And it's sorrowful that we don't just have a popular vote for president, because then I think all of us would be sleeping easy. So we got to first defend the vote at the precinct level, at the county level, at the state level. And then we got to defend the election in the electoral college, in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, and if need be, in a contingent election. In other words, we've got to make sure that we are every place in the constitutional architecture where the Republicans might go to try to pull victory out of the jaws of this massive defeat that they've earned.
Well, there's so much more we could discuss, but we'll have to leave it here for now. Thank you so much for your time today, Congressman. See you soon and stay safe.
Pleasure's all mine, Dan. Thank you.
Thanks again. I'm Dan Schulman, and it's been a real pleasure to be with all of you today. Remember, you can watch this event again. Please share it. And above all, please follow the work of the great team of journalists at Mother Jones who are toiling away to bring you the stories you need to understand and make sense of these crazy, crazy times. Take care and see you on the other side of this election. I'm Dan Schulman. See you later.